You live your life quietly in a village alongside a beautiful waifu, although your goal is to reach the capital and learn magic. However, one day you end up being severely attacked by an individual, and just when you think all is lost, the waifu who has always been by your side tells you that you are immortal, revealing a great power that has always been hidden. Chapter 1. The anime begins with many waifus greeting this guy named Nagi, who seems to be the teacher of the place, but then he sneezes and, well, sends everyone's clothes flying. But we don't show that, don't be gross. Anyway, then we see this waifu speaking, who says that everything happened 80 years ago. There we see that her name was Evangeline, who was 700 years old and was a vampire. There she tells us that eternal life is not as great as we think, saying that obviously it has good things, but as time goes by, you start losing people and you have to move on. Although in that moment this guy who kind of transforms into another one calls her, which makes her a little happier. And well, that's how in a change of scene we see this waifu already grown up who, well, has two huge reasons to love her, but then out of nowhere she is attacked by these students, but quickly stops them easily with a magical barrier. After this, the teacher, already in the classroom, says that if they can defeat her, she will let them leave the village to reach the capital, but in passing she also tells them that they couldn't defeat her in 100 years, so they're kind of screwed. At this point, all the kids complain because she used magic, but she shuts them up with a good smack. Anyway, after this we see this teacher calling for teacher Yukaheim, so well, we'll call her that. The thing is that he tells her that she's being too strict with the kids and that she should give them a chance, to which she kind of says she'll think about it. Well, after that, we see him with his buddies complaining about the teacher, besides mentioning that it's common in the capital to use magic and that there are some devices that make it even easier, but well, then the protagonist shows up, telling them that the only thing left for them is to train hard and defeat her in order to reach the tower, also known as the orbital elevator, although he quickly says goodbye to them and goes to visit his deceased parents, although the worst part is that he doesn't even remember them. There we find out that some time ago there was an accident where he was the only survivor, and there he was welcomed by the waifu Yukaheim. At first, they didn't get along, but over time their relationship improved. Anyway, they're in the cemetery. The protagonist ends up seeing what seems to be a kind of ghost who tells him that they were waiting for him and then disappears. After this, we see the protagonist and the waifu having dinner, where the guy quickly starts training to one day defeat the waifu, but another day passes and she beats them up again, this time kicking them out of class. Right there, the teacher appears and tells them that he could help them with the magic stuff. This obviously excites them and they accept, but the teacher tells them not to tell anything to the waifu, although of all the guys, the only one who couldn't get his magic out was the protagonist, where the teacher tells him that there is a way to fix it. That's how we see him with this bracelet, which he gives to Yukaheim once he sees her as a gift, but since he was nervous, he quickly leaves the place. Then another day passes and we see the waifu leaving the convenience store when she is attacked by her students, who leave her immobilized. Just then the protagonist was on his way to the place, but out of nowhere, the teacher arrives where the waifu is, who suddenly attacks the guys and knocks them out, and then attacks the waifu directly, who tries to use magic to defend herself but fails due to the bracelet. So this teacher deceived us all. Just as the guy was about to finish her off, the protagonist arrives just in time, throwing a punch at him, but the villain dodges it, then quickly attacks him, leaving him without an arm, and when he was about to finish him off, the waifu intervenes, who had managed to move. She takes the opportunity to congratulate the protagonist for all the effort he has made, but after that, the villain pulverizes her. New people, what's happening? The villain was about to leave the place, but before that, he was going to finish off the other students, but then when the protagonist had already given up, he hears the voice of the waifu, who tells him not to give up, besides telling him that he is not just an ordinary human because years ago she herself had turned him into an immortal monster. Wait, what? Yes, people, as you heard, and besides this, for him to awaken his power, he had to drink her blood, so the determined protagonist does it, where suddenly the teacher throws something at him, and upon seeing what happens, the protagonist is ready to attack epically. Although there, the villain wounds him severely again, but the protagonist ends up regenerating quickly, and that's how he manages to give him a tremendous smack that sends him to sleep, but then the protagonist also faints, whereupon waking up, he finds himself in the arms of none other than waifu Yukaheim. Yes, people, the waifu is still alive. There she tells him that she had turned him into an immortal, as well as introducing herself as Evangeline, a 700-year-old vampire, and not only that, but she had also found his parents, who in their last words asked her to take care of their son. And that's how she made him immortal, something that the waifu kind of apologizes for, but he tells her not to worry because now he can always be by her side. That's how the protagonist and Yukaheim leave the village with a goal ahead, which was to reach the top of the tower. Chapter 2. Well, folks, this is how they begin their journey towards the tower. The waifu tells our protagonist that over the years, humanity has significantly decreased in number, but this bores the protagonist and he keeps walking. Besides, the protagonist asks why they they don't take a bus or something, to which the waifu tells him it would be dangerous as they could encounter a hunter. Anyway, there we see the protagonist quite cheerful, saying that on his journey he would make many friends, but Yukaheim tells him not to be so happy because being immortal wouldn't be as good as he thinks. Then he goes to take a bath and reflects a bit, realizing that indeed his friends would grow old while he would always remain young. Although just then he ends up meeting a girl in the place, or better said, a boy, as the protagonist had mistakenly thought it was a girl. Well, there he introduces himself as Kuramaru. Our guy, Tota, tells him that he and his waifu were on their way to the tower. We find out that Kuramaru was also heading to the tower because she had a mission to find a woman, or rather a vampire known as the Messenger of Darkness. She also tells us that she is a 700-year-old girl, which we already obviously know who she is. Well, just then, the waifu Yukaheim arrives, but the other girl quickly identifies her as Evangeline and attacks her. There, the waifu recognizes her as one of the Shinmei Ryu. They tell us that she comes from a clan called Fushigari, which is dedicated to hunting immortals, claiming that they are villains and all that. Although, well, the waifu was somewhat mistaken, but anyway, in the end, when Kuramaru was about to launch an attack, our blonde waifu stops her with a strong blow right in the heart. Then the protagonist thinks he had finished her off, but it wasn't really the case because there we realize that the girl was also immortal. So the protagonist tries to wake her up, but she doesn't wake up, so when he was going to check if she was a dude, she suddenly wakes up, where she becomes aggressive again, saying that she has to finish off Evangeline because her sister had asked her to do so, and in fact, if she didn't, she told her not to come back home ever again. Well, the thing is that the blonde girl tells her that if she wants to fight her, she would have to first fight the protagonist. She quickly accepts, although the protagonist gives her a condition that whoever wins would decide what the other would do. So a confrontation begins, but the protagonist manages to dodge all the blows, when suddenly the girl ends up splitting his head, although there the protagonist like a pro puts it back on and gives her a tremendous smack that sends the girl to sleep. There, the waifu thinks they will do dirty things to her, but the protagonist just tells her to be his friend. Well, then they go through some hot springs, but nothing important happens. We only find out that the small waifu that the protagonist encounters is none other than Yukaheim, who uses magic to look a bit older, but well. After this, Kuramaru reflects that apparently she had found a place where she truly belonged, where while they were walking, the blonde girl tells her that she could accept her as her new apprentice. On the other hand, later on, Tota thinks it would be great if all the immortals helped each other, so he proposes to create a group and go looking for and recruiting all the immortal people that exist. Their Yukaheim ends up laughing when suddenly many cars appear and many people come out who receive the blonde girl as a goddess, to which she had already created the organization of immortals called Yukyu Holder. Chapter 3. Well, after this, we see the protagonist and the others on a boat heading towards the organization's base. Their waifu Yukaheim talks to this girl in a red uniform who was a bit upset because the waifu had taken in the stupid protagonist. The blonde girl tells her to calm down a bit because both she and the protagonist are the most powerful individuals of all. According to the blonde girl, when the world ends, they could be the only survivors, and well, the girl didn't like that much. Anyway, once they arrive at the location, this man tells them that the entire area is the organization's base. We also see many guys who look like bodyguards being really happy that waifu Yukaheim has returned. On the other hand, this man with glasses named Makabe explains to our guys that there are different types of immortality. Some use magic, and others even have their lives like it's a video game. The thing, people, is that they are offered to be part of the organization. Obviously, they happily accept, but be careful because things wouldn't be so simple. It turns out that for this, they would have to pass a test which consists of fighting them one-on-one, and if they can even land a single blow, they would be in. There, the waifu in a uniform named Karen will fight against the protagonist, and the guy with glasses will fight against Kuramaru. The protagonist tries to make a surprise attack, but quickly receives a smack. And well, that's how both spend some time trying to attack them, but they had no success. We see that waifu Kuramaru fought with her sword and everything, but the man dodged everything. So, just then, a waifu with garbage bags passes by and ends up tripping. Our protagonist, being a gentleman, decides to help her carry things. The girl says she is just a regular human working there and ended up there due to a series of fate-related events. By the way, her name is Yuki, and our guy tells her that he would be happy to help with the rest of the things she is pending. On the other hand, we see the blonde waifu remembering the past when this guy had come to her to ask for the same test that the protagonist is now undergoing. They also show us that the red-haired guy had several waifus supporting him, but well, that doesn't really matter. What matters is that the waifu ends up commenting that this guy was the grandfather of the protagonist. And well, after this, we see the protagonist carrying some boxes to a warehouse, but they kind of don't know where it is, and they end up reaching this place where, after walking a bit, they find a buried sword, and they meet this guy, who is holder number 2. So, this guy is really powerful. Well, his name is Shishido, who who quickly tells the protagonist to try to pull out the sword. He noticed that his companion had one, but he didn't. Well, at first, he didn't want to, but then he ends up accepting and tries to pull it out. But then he realizes that it was too difficult, although out of nowhere, he hears a voice telling him to turn a knob, which he does and ends up easily pulling out the sword. This surprises Shishido, but there, everyone realizes that the sword was talking, and well, it tells the guy that he is the chosen one to use it. The old man asks for the sword, adjusts the knob again, and when he returns it to the protagonist, it leaves a giant hole. Well, the thing is that the guy tells them that they should train there these days to improve and defeat their rivals. So we see them training hard and helping waifu Yuki in their free time, where that's how they spend 7 days, just the deadline they had to try to pass the test. First, Kuramaru's fight begins, where the guy with glasses recognizes that he has improved a lot in strength and technique, but still has a long way to go, where we quickly see that the fight complicates for him as despite being very skilled. As the guy with glasses says, his attacks are too predictable. On the other hand, the protagonist talks to Karen, telling her that this time he wouldn't make any surprise attacks, where he quickly attacks her with his sword. On the other hand, Kuramaru was in trouble but ends up devising a plan where she manages to defeat the guy with glasses. And going back to the protagonist, he had almost defeated the girl when out of nowhere, he hears the scream of waifu Yuki, so he doesn't care about the fight and runs towards her. There we see giant monsters where together with waifu Karen, they manage to save the waifu. Not only that, but when everything is over, they tell the protagonist that he passed the test, and that's how they both get their first mission to eliminate all the enemies that manage to enter the base. Chapter 4. So, another day passes where now the blonde waifu gives our protagonists their true first mission, which would be to accompany Karen to a city of humans. There, we see them running towards the place where they kind of explain to us that over the years, poverty in the world has increased a lot, so these areas are called slums, where the even bigger problem is that there are people who seek to end all the poor in the world. So there, as Karen says, the Yuki Holder is an organization that is not only made up of immortals, but also seeks to help these people who live in poverty and are threatened by the richest. Well, in the end, the protagonist arrives at the place and kind of thinks that these guys in black were the bad guys, but nah, they were just more agents of the organization, so everything's chill. Well, then after a while, they start with an arm wrestling competition where everyone ends up beating the poor protagonist, who after losing has to cook. There, he surprises with his cooking skills, and even Karen admits that he has talent. Anyway, then she recommends that if he wants to beat them in arm wrestling, he should practice a move called the lightning step. On the other hand, we see the three waifus talking, and their Kuramaru finds out that life there was really challenging, so she is convinced to give her best to help them. And going back to the protagonist, he starts practicing this lightning step, running very fast. However, in the distance, this guy observes him, who approaches the protagonist and tells him that he wasn't doing the movement he was practicing correctly because, for example, the protagonist was kicking up a lot of dust and stuff. There, the guy shows him the correct movement, showing us as if he literally teleported. Anyway, there he is also surprised to hear that the protagonist had just started practicing it that day because it had taken him years. Well, in that same moment, the protagonist doesn't really understand why the heck this would help him win in arm wrestling, when suddenly the other guy gives him a tremendous smack, explaining that the feet are fundamental to win, so nothing. Toda starts practicing hard, even cooking with his feet and everything. I mean, this guy is taking it really seriously. In fact, he even motivated this other guy to practice with him, so now they were practicing together. But then we see the guy who was teaching the protagonist transform into a werewolf, along with these two guys who are a group of bad guys, seeking to eliminate the immortals. Karen waifu was bathing when this guy appears behind her, although the waifu manages to confront him, but not for long. On the other hand, the protagonist was with the young man he was practicing with when they noticed that the area is under attack from afar as there are fires. Suddenly they were about to be attacked, but Kuramaru arrives to help, but this doesn't last long because then the werewolf and the other bad guy arrive. There the wolf finds out that the protagonist is an immortal but tells him that it won't do him much good with him, making a very strange attack that leaves him completely paralyzed. Meanwhile, Kuramaru manages to give the wolf a bit of a fight but quickly ends up completely beaten as well. Chapter 5. Well, she realizes that the protagonist was paralyzed with some kind of strange magic, so now they were really screwed. But when the werewolf was about to take out Kuramaru, the guy who was practicing with the protagonist interferes. And well, on the other hand, we see that a story is told to us that many years ago, a witch ended up being burned in a village, but she didn't die, so one day out of nowhere, a young girl ended up taking the girl away. Well, there we realize that the person who took the girl away was Karen, who was still being attacked by this villain, who spends a good while speaking ill of her. On the other hand, going back to the boy, he can't do anything to the werewolf as expected, so the next thing he would do would be to finish him off, although right there Kuramaru tries to save him. But the one who stops the blow is none other than our protagonist, protagonist? Yes, people, this guy is on fire. And well, before we continue with that, Karen kicks the villain in the nuts and kind of also power-ups, leaving the guy completely knocked out and well now what everyone was waiting for. We see the protagonist who got a tremendous power-up and now his arms are completely OP. Well, like this he gives the werewolf a smack that literally sends him almost to the lobby. This more than scaring the werewolf excites him because he wanted to fight more against the protagonist. Well, right there Karen arrives where the protagonist realizes that the werewolf was the guy who was training him. Well, there they continue the fight, exchanging some tremendous smacks. Although suddenly the guy unleashes more power and ends up making a tremendous hole in the protagonist's chest. Literally, he left a hole like she left my heart. Man, what happened? Well, anyway, suddenly the protagonist unleashes another power-up and manages to get up. In that moment, the other villain who was in front of Karen says that that power couldn't be anything other than dark magic. There they tell us that there have only been two people who have tried to create that power. One was Yukaheim, who had failed, and the other was the waifu's disciple, who did manage to do it. Well, at that point, the protagonist really unleashes a tremendous blow to the bad guy, then continues to land several punches. In that moment, he says he surrenders and prepares to be finished off, but the protagonist manages to stop him, making him come to his senses because of the power-up he sent, sort of changing who he was. So now he tells him that he won't finish him because he wants to keep fighting until he can't get up anymore. But the bad guy challenges him to an arm wrestling duel where he flips a coin and when it falls, boom, things start. We see that the guy takes a big lead and almost wins. But then the protagonist preaches to him, saying how could he, with so much power, use it for evil? Suddenly, the protagonist summons a lot of strength with which he ends up blowing up the building, thus winning the duel. And well, once everything is over, the town is still in flames, but waifu Yukaheim arrives and with magical power, she puts out everything with ice, then sees the enemies manage to escape. Chapter 6. And well, that's how we move on to a new day where Kuramaru was carrying the protagonist's sword as she had asked her to take it to him since he literally had forgotten about it and didn't use it at all. Although there, while talking to the sword, it tells her that it had noticed that she had feelings for the protagonist, which makes Kuramaru really nervous and she runs away, leaving the sword lying there. There she ends up seeing the protagonist in the distance and kind of wonders why she feels so strange looking at him, and come on, people, we all know why. Well, on the other hand, we see our guy chatting with Yuki. There she ends up taking him for a ride on her jet ski that she had created. This really excites the protagonist. Plus, we find out that the waifu Yuki had a dream of being able to compete in a professional race like that, so the protagonist encourages her to follow her dream. On the other hand, waifu Karen enters Kuramaru's room where finally someone realizes that she is a girl. There she tells her not to tell Toda anything. And it turns out that Kuramaru is neither a girl nor a boy because where she came from, which was this kind of family or whatever that wanted to eliminate immortals, well, all these people were semi-humans who, when they reach a certain age of adolescence, choose whether to be a boy or a girl. Well, their waifu Karen starts a fight, telling her to choose to be a girl to be with the protagonist forever since she doesn't trust her being with Yukaheim. Anyway, after this blonde guy appears who ends up telling them that he has a plan for Kuramaru. Well, there quickly we see the protagonist who was wondering where the hell Kuramaru was when suddenly this beautiful blonde girl arrives who turns out to be none other than Kuramaru disguised as a girl. All of this was the other guy's plan, although come on. It was clear from Kuramaru's face that she also liked the idea. Anyway, there she presents herself to the protagonist as Kuramaru's cousin. Well, after chatting a bit, she ends up asking the protagonist to accompany her to explore the capital, which he accepts, and they have a pretty good time. On the other hand, we see waifu Yukaheim talking to this guy where she tells him that she was worried because he would appear and look for the protagonist because of everything that has happened with this weird magic last time. And when she says she refers to this guy named Fate Avarancus. Anyway, there the protagonist and waifu arrive at a part of the tower where after a while, out of nowhere, an enemy appears who captures the protagonist in the blink of an eye. Waifu throws some punches but ends up being defeated because in her girl's body, she feels that her body is much weaker. However, she doesn't give up and attacks again, but this time she is captured just like the protagonist, where now when she was about to give up, she remembers the protagonist's words, which kind of gives her a power-up where this time, as the usual Kuramaru, she manages to escape from the prison where she and the protagonist were, and as they had already lost a lot of time, the enemies end up fleeing. Then the protagonist wakes up and Kuramaru is in front of him in her usual attire, where we hear that the waifu thinks that no matter what happens, she or he will always be together with the protagonist. Ah, folks, how nice. Well, after this, we see the blonde guy from a while ago talking to this little girl who was performing some kind of ritual in which, well, we don't know what it's for, but she says that something important and special is about to begin. Chapter 7. Okay, after this, in a scene change, we see that our protagonists meet with Karen, Karen, the blonde guy, and this little girl named Kirie. Well, this girl suddenly asks the protagonist to talk alone, a bit strange, but okay. After walking for a while, we see that the girl tells him that she senses him, then she starts giving him really strange orders, telling him that he didn't protect her on 5 occasions, something that is not very clear. But suddenly the waifu is gravely attacked by someone. There the girl tells him to take her hand. The protagonist does it, and quickly we see him appear with the waifu at the organization's base, and seriously, people, what the heck is happening? Well, there the waifu explains that she had traveled to the past, and well, the protagonist, without understanding much, ends up getting on this boat with Karen, the blonde guy, and waifu Kirie. There she explains that her power consisted of reversing time through sand rituals, where if she takes someone else's hand, she carries their soul with her, which well explains why the protagonist had to shake her hand. Well, apart from that, the waifu tells him that she had gone back 5 times in time, and in none of them had the protagonist shaken her damn hand. Anyway, there, after arriving at the same place as the last time, Kirie asks the protagonist again to talk alone, when suddenly Tota reacts quickly and gives this guy a smack, who recovers, and when trying another attack this time, the protagonist intercepts with his Opie sword, with which he carries a lot of weight and gives the guy a good smack. Anyway, after this, the girl explains everything. It turns out that all those times she had traveled back in time was because she had captured the protagonist. All of this was done by this white-haired guy named Fate, who, in a memory of the waifu when she was just chatting with Koromaru, an explosion occurs where we see the protagonist in trouble because this Fate guy had managed to take out everyone in the place, and she barely managed to end his life and thus go back in time. Well, after telling him all this, just then Karen and the blonde guy appear who had heard everything that happened. There, the protagonist tells them that he can travel back in time and that it's messed up, but this angers the waifu because after this, they explain that it's not good to reveal the type of immortality each person has because it could be used as a weakness in the future. Anyway, the thing is that everyone manages to give more confidence to Kirie, and she starts explaining her plan. There, everyone takes specific positions to wait for the bad guy, and once they have him right where they want him, they pretend to trap him in a place. Anyway, the protagonist was already prepared when he starts searching for info about the bad guy on his phone, when suddenly he receives a call from Yukaheim, who tells him that Fate had been a friend of his grandfather, and that a long time ago. The 3 of them had saved the world from different problems. However, once the protagonist's grandfather died, Fate changed his ways and became a bad guy. Well, this kind of distracts the protagonist from the plan, but finally, Fate appears among the people, although the bad thing is that the attack had to be cancelled because right next to the bad guy were the protagonist's childhood friends. Chapter 8. How great! Once they see him, obviously they're going to greet him and all, and even though the blonde was going to attack despite the cancellation, he's stopped by this maid-dressed waifu. Anyway, back to the protagonist, he tries to take his friends elsewhere, but then Fate arrives, introducing himself as an old friend of his grandfather, but the protagonist becomes defensive. This leads Fate to threaten him with his friends, but the protagonist stands up and says that since Fate had rubbed him the wrong way right off the bat, he felt obliged to fight him. So, just when it seemed like he was about to throw the first punch, he starts shouting at the top of his lungs that there's a baddie with a bomb in the area, which kind of distracts Fate, and Karen lands a punch from behind. The protagonist takes advantage and sends another blow with his sword, but now with a weight of 500 tons, surprising Fate as he managed to break his barrier. Well, then the redhead makes a move and manages to activate the planned attack from the beginning, thus creating the opportunity for Kirie to grab the baddie and lock him up, but for this, the others also had to touch the waifu, and since not everyone was close, Fate ends up petrifying the waifu, and no, folks, things just got more complicated. Well, after this, we see that everyone tries to defend themselves from their opponent's attacks as best they can because, yes, 2 more baddies had arrived earlier who were fighting with Koromaru and Karen. The protagonist was also giving his all in his fight, although then Karen calls him, telling him that the waifu Kirie had left a timer. So, the protagonist tells her to keep fighting until the timer runs out. So, on his part, he starts buying time with Fate, although there comes a moment when he's cornered, but then the protagonist increases the weight of his sword, falling right in the middle of all his pals, and just when the time's up, the petrification on the waifu is lifted and she sends them all to the cave. I mean, literally, the plan went perfectly. Nah man, these guys are geniuses. Well, there's Yukaheim there too, with whom they were sort of about to start a fight, but in the end, they don't. Fate proposes that each one of them there ask him a question, to which he will answer honestly, and once it's done, they'll let him go. They agree and start extracting information from him, where we end up finding out that Fate needed the protagonist because he wanted to save Negi, the protagonist's grandfather, and this would also save the lives of 12 million people. Then another good question is from Koromaru, asking how urgently Fate needed the protagonist, to which he says there was no rush, and well, finally the protagonist tells Fate that from what he's heard, he kind of notices he's not a bad person. But that's when he asks if fate was the one who ended his parents' lives, to which he responds yes, and with this, the protagonist kind of gets so angry that he has a very rapid power-up, although just as he was about to attack, there's like a kind of projection where nothing more and nothing less than Negi was, who tells the protagonist not to believe fate about what he said because he really had no bad intentions. Then Yukaheim tells Kuramaru telepathically to stop the transmission. So when Negi was about to tell the protagonist something about the truth, she just cuts the hologram. Chapter 9. Well, another day goes by and we see the waifus talking. Kuri was upset about all the effort she had put in to let fate go, but well, Karen then realizes that the others were kind of falling for the protagonist. Anyway, I'm just saying that the protagonist is slowly building a harem. After this, we see Tota trying to talk to Yukaheim, but she completely ignores him. On the other hand, a blonde lady arrives at the place looking for Yukaheim, and this beautiful waifu is looking for Tota. We see that Tota was training with his sword, somewhat annoyed that his waifu had ignored him. Then he ends up meeting Yuki, and they have tea while chatting for a while. However, the other waifus were already spying on them, feeling a bit jealous. Out of nowhere, the young blonde from earlier appears, introducing herself as Mizore. She arrives eager to duel the protagonist, claiming that he belongs to a family of playboys, stating that his grandfather conquered the hearts of many waifus. However, she finds that unacceptable and gives him a solid punch. Although the protagonist defends himself and sends the poor waifu flying, he ends up saving her, making her quickly fall in love with him. But that's not the end of it, folks. Mizore then proposes to be the protagonist's girlfriend. Wait, what? Yes, but the protagonist rejects her instantly. In a scene change, we see Yukaheim talking with the blonde lady, reminiscing about their school days where all the girls loved Negi. The blonde would get jealous and try to be the best waifu in the place. Back to the present, Mizore prepares lunch for the protagonist, which he enjoys. Meanwhile, the waifus continue spying on him. When the blonde waifu first appears, she gives them advice that if they want to make the protagonist fall in love, they should take him to the hot springs and wash his sword, and that way they would win his love. Now, going back to the waifu's conversation, the blonde notices something strange about Yukaheim, realizing it's because she's afraid that something bad might happen to Tota. However, she tells Yukaheim not to be afraid because, as Negi always said, true magic is having courage. Nah, this girl is feeling poetic. Okay, moving on to the hot springs. Once the protagonist was there all relaxed, the war begins, and well, they all end up fighting until out of nowhere, Yukaheim is the one who ends up washing the protagonist's sword. Anyway, she asks to talk later. When they finally meet to talk, Yukaheim tells him that his grandfather was possessed by a very powerful villain a long time ago who ended up imprisoning him with her power, and he has been trying to survive for over 20 years. Not only does she reveal this, but she also discloses that his parents didn't die in the accident because he never really had parents. The protagonist was a clone of his grandfather. Chapter 10. Well, folks, after this news that even left me stunned, we see the protagonist quite sad. However, Mizore ends up coming to his room to invite him to a big event in the city. It was an arena battle where the most powerful would be chosen based on the victories they achieved. This motivates the protagonist, so he gets happy to go and register for the tournament. We also see the waifu Yukaheim talking to the blonde lady. Our waifu tells her that she told the truth to the protagonist, but she doesn't really know if it was the best decision. Back to our guys, unfortunately, the protagonist couldn't register in time for the combat, so it's quite an F to be honest. While talking with Mizore, the lady appears, revealing her name as Ayaka. And there, these other waifus also introduced themselves, where the green-haired one named Mana says she was the school director before them, where, besides, her grandfather had worked there many years ago and they were his students. Ayaka takes the protagonist to see the classroom where he used to teach, where they tell us that he became a teacher when he was just 10 years old. In a little flashback, we see his first day. On the other hand, out of nowhere, this ghost girl appears, who was also a student of Negi. So, finally, Ayaka approaches the protagonist and preaches a bit, saying that he shouldn't really feel bad for being a clone because if Negi were here, he would recognize him as his grandson. So there, the protagonist realizes how much they cared for him. Out of nowhere, Mana receives a call that a contestant has been injured, so our protagonist will be his replacement. That's how we quickly see him enter the battle arena where he faces off against this hooded man named Cutlass. The fight quickly turns into a disadvantage for the protagonist because this guy was not only ripped but also knew about the protagonist and that he was a clone. Just when the protagonist was cornered, out of nowhere comes Negi himself, the protagonist's grandfather, who tells him they need him and to go with him to the top of the tower. But there, the protagonist begins to question the actions of the supposed Negi, and after this, we see Yukaheim saving a spell that breaks the barrier they had set up, and we see the waifu arrive, who, along with the others, prepare for a rather epic fight because, as the waifu says, he's not Negi, but he's none other than the magician from the beginning. Chapter 11. Okay, things are getting complicated excited, folks, because besides this, more allies of the enemy appear who are very dangerous according to what our waifu Yukaheim tells us. And well, when the fight was about to begin, we see that our protagonist is kind of teleported to another place where he sees from a distance that waifu Yukaheim was lying on the ground, looking very injured. And when the protagonist tries to help her, he is transported to another place where he meets this guy, who, by the way, is the creator of his sword. But well, he tells him that he has the mission to convince him to join them. He starts showing us the story of Yukaheim and how one day she fell in love with the great-grandfather of the protagonist, who was also called Negi. We see that over the years, he died, and the waifu took Negi as her disciple, who is now the protagonist's grandfather. But over time, she also fell in love with him. Then, the protagonist says he hasn't changed his mind about anything, when out of nowhere, the magician from the beginning appears, introducing herself as Lalda. There, she tries to attack Yukaheim, but the protagonist protects her. She reveals that she created Toda because she was tired of wandering alone through life, as she always ended up alone over the years. Then, the protagonist, like a boss, tells her that he will always accompany her. After this, the waifu starts to recover a bit and tells the protagonist that it would be their chance to fight against the villain. However, the magician ends up trapping them with mental tricks. So, the waifu sees Negi and the protagonist sees his friends dragging him to the bottom of the water. But watch out, because out of nowhere, a waifu appears to the protagonist, who with a strong blow manages to save him and takes him to a beach. There, she introduces herself as Asuna, saying that she is his grandmother. Wait, what? Nah, folks, I don't understand anything anymore. Well, folks, let's not lose sight of the important stuff. This girl, as we see, is very powerful and ends up giving information to the whole group of the protagonist to be able to return to the initial battle and win it. That's how out of nowhere they return to the present and everyone starts attacking, thus reaching the cheap copy of Negi, where the protagonist unleashes his power-up and manages to confront him. Chapter 12. Here we see the others buying time against the enemies, but just when the protagonist had no strength left, Yukaheim and Fate arrive to help him. With a strange power, Fate shows us the real Negi, who is in his child form. Fate tells him his plan to save him and humanity because he wanted to make them all immortal and end their suffering. But Negi tells him that his plan could only be achieved if he died because his soul was already part of the magician from the beginning. This deeply saddens Fate, and as time was running out, the waifu embraces him. But all of this is suddenly interrupted by the fake Fate, who had powered up and quickly knocked Fate and Yukaheim out of the battle. However, the protagonist, just like the fake Negi, also powered up. In this way, we see them fighting for a while, but the protagonist eventually manages to land some blows on Negi's face. However, another baddie arrives and leaves his sword stuck in him. There, we see that they were going to finish off the protagonist, but out of nowhere, the waifu Kiri intervenes, telling them they're finished because they know that if they harm her, she could go back in time. But then, this damn baddie ends up injuring the waifu anyway. However, the waifu smiles at the protagonist, saying that everything was going according to plan. So suddenly, the evil Negi appears in front of all these waifus, who start attacking him non-stop, even waifu Yukaheim in her child form throwing punches at him. However, out of nowhere, all the waifus explain to him that they live in the memories of the protagonist, and that's why they are now helping him. The evil Negi tells them that it's impossible because he only had the genes of Asuna and himself, to which the waifus tell him that it's not true. Suddenly, Asuna appears and tells him she's sorry for leaving him alone all this time. She also tells him that now she will join him, giving them all a little more time. Surprisingly, the evil Negi accepts and leaves the place, thus ensuring that everyone survives. And well, after all this, one day out of nowhere, Toda goes to none other than Yukaheim to declare his love for her, telling her that he wants to protect her for life and that he wants to marry her. But the waifu tells him no. So maybe he didn't end up with her, but he did end up with a tremendous harem. And well, some people are just lucky.